They'll be here. Yes.
So, since we have a little time before people arrive, what's been happening at the conference so far? What kind of context are you in, so to speak?
Well, I have, yesterday there were plenary sessions, so everybody was in there. And it was very interesting. Everybody's speech was really very interesting, very important, that I can't go into details right now. And this morning we were in one of the sessions that was the whole morning about the imagination and play in education. And there were two very long presentations because some of the speakers didn't come, which was also true for yesterday afternoon. And one of them was Peg what was it?
Don't try and get your tongue around it, Anna.
And she has a program of a play and drama in education that she is doing in Bosnia, and now a new project in Serbia. And some of her examples were just incredible. I just heard a little bit because we were late a little bit. And then there was a Professor Michael Michel from Australia, and he had a very interesting presentation about teaching of Shakespeare to the immigrant students in high school in Australia who are just learning English. So that was just marvelous.
And is there anybody at your conference, if you're doing imagination and play, from Kajaani, from Finland?
I don't think so.
No, we've met so far.
No.
There's because we have very active interaction going between Central Finland and.
I thought, I was hoping that Kirill or somebody from his group be here, but
No, it'd be Pentti Hakkarainen is the director of that in Kajaani, or Oulu Kajaani.
she's not.
Yeah.
She's not here.
Well, I wasn't planning to go in that direction anyway, but when you raised it, it's clear set of common interest there. And interestingly, Sonja Baumer, who is from Belgrade, here in our laboratory, is interacting with the people from Finland and people from Sweden on this big interest in narrative and drama within which adults participate. It's not just setting it up for the little children to engage in pretend play. It's partly like the work of Vivian Paley, partly it's the work of a Swedish developmental psychologist who emphasizes play and emotion. And so the adults introduce themes which are emotionally laden for the children, and they participate as small children in these plays.
This program does something like that. She does something like that, teaching teachers to become part of the dramatic world that is set up for teaching of some of the concepts that may be very difficult to say in a situation which is scary.
Right.
Sometimes just talking in a different accent may be dangerous.
Well, our Russian colleagues will appreciate that the scary element here is Baba Yaga, and they have a very interesting sort of doll of Baba Yaga and then lost children, and the adults start out by modeling and participating, and then involve the children in it, and you can really see. Working on the issue of how can you tell when the play frame kicks in and the instructional frame is pushed aside? How can we?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in my analysis, which will be on Thursday. How do you cross between the two worlds, go into the fictive and go out, and how do you know where you are at the moment?
Well, for some. Right. For some future occasion, I think there's clearly that theme there's a very significant group in our laboratory which is working directly on that theme and doing it in this framework, primarily with Nordic countries at the moment, primarily. Right.
The other people here come. I didn't see Michael there. Thanks. But I'm not working in my day job at the moment. I'm doing something else.
Добрый вечер. Now, Vladimir, он там? Нет. Ага. И кто сопровождает нас вот в это дело с вашей стороны?
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Наталья Гадамашко.
Перед разговором нажимайте кнопку.
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Наталья Гадамашко. Владимир попросил мне помочь. Здравствуйте, Михаил Лестерович.
Рад тебя видеть, в конце концов.
Очень приятно.
Okay. Но,
Михаил Лестерович, извините, у нас Гита Львовна здесь тоже сидит. Вот она вам передает большой привет. Вы ее видите? Гита Львовна.
Она не видно сейчас, только плеча.
Вот она рядом со мной.
Ага. Но с другой стороны.
Вот.
Добрый вечер. Добрый вечер.
Мы рады очень все вас видеть.
Спасибо. Ну как, Наталья, начинаем?
Да, пожалуйста.
Но как более реально, чтобы я старался делать по-русски, и мне помогает Ольга, или по-английски. Я просто аудиторию не хорошо знаю и стараюсь общаться. Мне не видно, как это лучше делать.
Лучше, наверное, по-английски, Михаил Лестерович, а мы попробуем с Ольгой вам помочь в переводе, да?
Мы можем...
Ну, то есть, как хотите, да?
Я думаю, мы можем делать и то, и другое. Есть недоразумение, недопонимание, мы можем просто изменить стиль.
Хорошо, давайте начнем и попробуем.
Okay. Ну, на первых... And you can see PowerPoint there? You can see what I'm seeing, but...
Yes.
Okay. So, you can see the title. I'm focusing on three concepts. The concept of mediation, опосредствование, the concept of consciousness, сознание, and the concept of creativity. And I'm going to try to bring those three concepts together around the idea of воображение, the concept of imagination. and use that as a way to examine the nature of human images, the nature of human thought processes. No, кто среди русских меня понял?
Все помнят?
Ну, скажите
Все
откровенно.
поняли?
Okay. So we begin with these just basic considerations. The first is Vygotsky is very well known for many reasons because he offers many different starting points for a discussion of creativity and imagination in education. And that I want to focus on the idea that mediation is the cornerstone for the analysis of higher psychological functions. Я думаю, что это очень видно нам всем. Если это не ясно, тогда мы должны остаться и обсуждать. Дальше. Continue. Okay? You've got to give me feedback. Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Don't you?
Is it clear?
Okay. Everybody has the right to speak at literally at any time. It's the only way this is going to work, right? Okay. So then I misspelled this, but this is the problem of translation, перевода. And I quote the Russian poet Tsvetaeva, who notes that there are certain ideas that simply cannot be properly expressed in other languages. That the problem of translation can be very, very serious, so we really don't understand each other, even when we're using the same words. And I think that this problem applies to all of the key terms in this discussion. Значит, опосредствование, mediation, сознание, consciousness, and творчество, creativity. And then I'm going to introduce this fourth term, воображение, which will try to bring these together. So we'll start here with the term опосредствовать and mediate. In English, mediation is used in many ways that are not relevant for considering the linkages between mediation, consciousness, and creativity. For our purposes, the key idea is captured by a pair of oppositions. When I try to explain mediation to my students, I use these oppositions. We say in English that something can have a direct effect, or we can say, I have direct knowledge of this. Or we can substitute the word immediate. I have immediate knowledge of this. This has an immediate effect upon me. Okay, you will in a second. Then, in English, I say, what's the opposite of a direct effect? And that comes out an indirect effect. And what's a synonym? What's equal to an indirect effect? A mediated effect, which is the opposite of an immediate effect. Because in English, in normal language, if we contrast immediate and mediated, they're understood as in completely different semantic spheres. Olga вам скажет по-русски. Okay, well, she wants me to say it myself. Okay. That is, these terms, when we discuss them among ourselves, it would be as if you said in Russian, прямое воздействие, это может быть непосредственное воздействие. Косвенное воздействие, это как опосредственное воздействие. Но и тоже то, что опосредственное воздействие, это вот эквивалент как, или наоборот, от immediate effect, от непосредственного воздействия. Я думаю, надеюсь, что это ясно. Просто, что сам идея опосредствования включает идеи косвенно, or in English, indirect. So that indirect effect, or indirectness, and mediatedness mean the same thing. And whenever I talk about this with an American audience, they have an insight into their own language, because the term mediation tends to be off in this completely different semantic field. Okay, so I believe it's the case that in Russian the morphemes provide a more direct or less mediated access to the meaning of the term itself. That опосредование is related to посредник, which is a mediator, which in turn is related to посередина, in the middle. So that for Russians, even if it's frozen somewhat, it's easier to see deeper into the meaning of the words than is true in English, where the idea of acting indirectly or through something becomes, I'm saying, more accessible in Russian than in English. So we need to take that into consideration. Согласен? Do you agree? Okay. Well, you're all being quiet. It's probably you've had a long day and you're tired.
Согласны, согласны.
Okay, спасибо. So the second term then would be consciousness and сознание. Again, in Russian, the idea of of co-knowledge, that knowledge is something shared by people, is there to be seen in the word. So you have is with, and znania is knowledge. So knowledge then is somehow not just inside an individual, it's something you do with somebody else. In English, the term has fused its constituent meanings, and consciousness is ordinarily considered a trait of purely individual, private, unsocialized psychological action. If you're sufficiently educated in English to have studied Latin, then you get some help, because con is a root for with, and I can't even pronounce it, but the second part of it, shness, that becomes science or knowledge in Latin. But in general, I've studied neither Latin nor Greek, and for me, that's just a fossilized, fused concept. So consequently, when Marx or Vygotsky refer to consciousness as the sum of social relations, it can be confusing to English speakers. Now let's go to the third term, creativity or tворчество. At one level, these items or these terms are used in the same way in both languages, to designate something that's novel. But not every novel thought or action is considered to be creative. It might simply be deviant, a non-replication of prior behavior or of, let's call it, reality. Vygotsky, those of you who are reading and read English fine, you can say that you can see what Vygotsky had to say. In this sense, all that is the work of the human hand, the whole world of culture, is distinguished from the natural world because it is the product of human imagination, воображение, and creativity based on imagination. По-русски, Olga will not speak, so you're going to have to listen to my bad Russian. В этом смысле свет творения рук человеческих, весь мир культуры, отличен от естественного мира в силу того, что этот продукт человеческого воображения и творчества, основанного на воображении. Now what about воображение? Because I want to focus in on this term. When Vygotsky combines the idea of the work of the human hand, culture, and creativity based on its link to воображение, he provides us with a magic path to be able to link mediation, consciousness, and creativity. And it's that path that I want to try to follow. In American psychology, the word imagination implies non-reality. It implies, it's a synonym for fantasy. Okay? And it has that meaning. It's a possible meaning in Russian, but I'm taking my use of the term in a different way. And I'm basing it on my experience with the writings of Alexander Suvorov, the blind, deaf, Soviet Russian psychologist, and an article that he wrote, which we translated. He wrote it in Vопроsi Psychologii in 1983. We published it almost immediately in our translation journal in 1983-84 issue. When you go and you look in a database at the translation in English that goes with the abstract, right, you'll find the following translation: the problem of forming imagination in blind, deaf, and dumb children. When I as editor, read the article at first, I couldn't understand it. I thought it was about fantasy, but he wasn't talking about fantasy. He was talking about the fundamental nature of all human cognition. And so, in trying to get across this more general usage of his, I used the term which was present and adhered to this day in most of cognitive psychology in the United States, of representation. And therefore, if you look in the database, you'll find that when the same article appears twice, and in its English translation, there you have the translation, the formation of representation in deaf-blind children. Why? Why the difference? Okay. Понятно сейчас? Русский. Natalia, is everybody understanding?
Да, кажется, все довольны, всем все понятно.
Okay, okay. Но я
Да,
должен
да,
от вас
ребята?
зависеть. Я могу...
Громче, громче, да, понятно.
My brain is not getting enough oxygen, that's one.
No, well, but if your brain is not getting enough oxygen in English, I'm not going to worry about you. So,
Окей, хорошо, нам понятно.
okay, so now I want to pursue this term, воображение and imagination. Okay? So, what I was doing, as I put in point number 1, is I was assimilating the term imagination to the term fantasy. And clearly, Suvorov was not talking about fantasy. So that was where I was put in cognitive conflict with myself. I believe he was talking about the basic issue of human cognition in light of the content of the article. And I recommend you reading the article yourself. It's a fascinating article. And I wrote this footnote where I substituted and explained why I wanted to use representation. But as I continued to work, I began to realize that his idea was much more interesting than the idea of representation. Representation, as used in American cognitive psychology, is the product of a psychological process that is like a mental unit, right? It's a very complex term, representation, but representation is process, very rare to encounter. Okay, here's how Vygotsky warned us not to fall prey to turning processes into fossilized objects. He wrote, что должно нас интересовать, это не окончательный результат, не сумма или произведение развития, а сам процесс генеза, или становление высшей формы ее живой аспект. And those of you who read English can read perfectly well in English that he's focusing on process, not on product. So, воображение, the foundation of creativity, must be treated as process, not as, again, my bad typing, as static individual person, as a static individual personal quality. But what's the process? Что это за процесс? Okay, now we have to do some more work on unfreezing the word, at least for American audience. Okay, so I've broken it up into 3 parts. obraz, zhenya, right? And the first part, the prefix, is a prefix of Russian of something going into something else. Vavlech, vabrazit, which is what we're talking about here. Obraz, there we have no difficulty. We have the word image. In English, very close, as far as I can tell, to Russian. And then we have the suffix and ending. Right? So when I saw it like this and it became unfrozen for me, I began to think of vabrazhenia in English as a process of making images. And I write it in this slightly odd way, which you'll come upon later, as into image making, if I were keeping the order of the Russian, the process of making an image. So Suvorov gives it a metaphor for what he means by this process. And he says, vabrazhenia means to rise up off the world and return to it again. To rise up off the world and return to it again. So it's a constant process of this sort. Okay? That's going to be very, very important to keep in mind. Now, this means, and if I was to put this in words, that a process of separation and subsequent fusion, synthesis perhaps, maybe analysis and synthesis, repeated constantly, is the foundation of human cognition and is the process, as process, of human consciousness. Now, vabrazhenia and mediation. In order, and this is my line of thought, I wouldn't blame this on Suvorov, but if you like it, you can attribute it to him. That to understand the significance of Suvorov's metaphor, we must put time into the unit of analysis. Должно быть время в единице анализа. Должно быть, как процесс. So, without time, без времени, we could describe what Suvorov was saying by something that goes like this. Note, right? And there's time, in a sense, okay? But I think about it in a different way. And here, Scott, just to warn you, I'm about to move. All right? So I'm going to engage in a little bit of movement because I tried to get this onto PowerPoint, and I'm afraid my life has gotten sufficiently complicated in the last few weeks that I didn't have time to arrange to do this. So I'm going to act it out for you. Okay? So now, and I'll show you an abstract version of this later, because this is rising up and returning to the world, but you're always staying in the same place. But what if we now, let's treat the ground where we are as part of any sort of normal human action. We're not only moving through time, we're moving through time and space at the same time. So now let's look at what we see if we put time in here. We're now, this axis, this floor, is both the ground, the world, and can be representing time. Then what happens is I start to move. If I keep on doing just this motion, it looks a little strange coming over like this. Right? Right. Right. Natalia's got it. And if we really, if we did it, you're coming up. You're rising off the world as you go to meet the world. You're following a path through life, we might say. Now, that for me, when I thought about the predicament of the blind deaf, gave me some insight into what Suvorov was talking about. Because without enculturation, how much distance is there? How do you manage to rise off the world? How do you manage to separate yourself from the world, since both of our major distance receptors, vision and hearing, are gone? So in some sense, the blind deaf person is right up against the world. And if you're right up against the world, according to his own ideas, thought is going to be very difficult. Okay. I'm going to continue a little bit, and then I'm going to back up and ask if this is generally understandable. I want to relate it now directly to representations which you're familiar with. You're certainly familiar with the representation on the left. It appeared in the English language. It appeared in the English language in 1929 in the Journal of Genetic Psychology in 3 famous articles that introduced the Cultural Historical School to American readers. And there you have, on the left-hand side, the basic mediational triangle, which is in all sorts of writings by Vygotsky and his followers. On the right-hand side, and those of you who've read my book, Cultural Psychology, either in English or in Russian, or in whatever language you happen to be speaking, see that what I've done is to put time in there and to point out that a triangle, like a circle, is a representation of structure without time. And I want to put time into the unit of analysis, and I apply this idea to the organization of reading. Right? And that's been published and I assume is available. But I think what's important is to focus on the fact that if you're moving through time, the world you re-encounter when you come back having separated yourself from the world is not going to be exactly the world you left as you moved away from it, as you rose off of it. And that there's a necessary return to the world, and when you return to the world, it is a world slightly, but necessarily, somewhat different from the world you rose off of before. And the human brain must resolve 2 sources of information about reality, which are related to each other, maybe in very high degree, but are to some extent distinct from each other. And that in that circle, in that process of resolution, that's the process where human consciousness as process occurs. That's where the synthesis, having done the analysis, must occur. And then, of course, you then have another rising up again and another coming together. Now I'm going to play with this idea in different kinds of representations. Now, вот Ольга здесь сомневает. Поняли ли вы, или мы должны здесь остановиться и обсуждать немножко? Natalia, how do you read your audience?
Я думаю, что мы поняли, потому что все внимательно слушают, никто не сомневается.
Okay. Это может значить, что она может делать вид, как наши студенты, что она слушает, пока она думает.
Может быть. Ну как, делаем вид или поняли? Поняли.
Отлично. Okay.
I have a question for later. Keep this moment in mind.
Okay, we'll have questions for later.
Oh yeah, this is a complex of ideas. So I think.
Keep it in mind for later, not now.
That's right. That's fine. I'm going to set the whole thing up for discussion, but I at least have to get it out. Okay.
Okay.
So, as indicated in the mediational triangle, where there's time in the unit of analysis, it's assumed that the mediated and unmediated sources of knowledge never entirely coincide. The need to resolve the necessary contradictions between mediated and direct routes of experience is a crucial precondition for consciousness, which is an active process of creating the illusion, a necessary illusion of the continuity of experience. Okay. Now, I'm going to go from here and use as a model for thinking about this problem the phenomena of fixed images on the retina. Now, there's been an enormous amount of work done in Russia on eye movements as it's related to thought, and maybe this is all very familiar to all of you, but I encountered it through American writing, teaching in a department of communication. And the great thing, of course, about teaching in a department of communication is that the central concept of communication is опосредствование. Okay, so I'm going to use fixed images on the retina, сетчатка. I propose a strong analogy between Suvorov's metaphor and research on fixed images on the retina. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the phenomena, and I'm going to produce them in a slightly unusual way, here are some basic facts which I'm assuming the truth of. First of all, if you take a special device, like something like a contact lens, and you know that your eyes are constantly making, what do you use? Is it по-русски?
Движение. Быстрое движение. Быстрое скачкообразное движение.
Right. So we know that our eyes are constantly doing this, in English, saccadic eye movements. Right? That's a fact. When you think about that fact up against Suvorov's idea with time in the unit of analysis, notice that you have an exact replication. That the human eye is constantly doing exactly what Suvorov says is necessary for the basic act of knowing the world. It fixates on a point in the world, it looks away, and then it comes back again, and the reality it comes back again to is not the reality it left. However little it deviates, it's not exactly the reality that it left. Maybe a movement of the head, I can move my head like this, but the clock seems to be there stably. We know if I literally stabilize it, it will disappear and the visual field goes gray. So without having the disconnection, the separation between the object, the world, and the movement and the resolution, you cannot have full recognition of, you cannot see the object in its entirety. Okay. As the image disappears, it breaks into pieces. The whole image does not reappear until the image is allowed to move freely across the retina. However, if you get a little bit of discoordination, if you get a little bit of movement, maybe because the apparatus is not perfect, then you get pieces of the image coming back. Now, what's really interesting is you get different kinds of pieces coming back depending upon the content of the image. Here, this picture is slightly inaccurate in that, in trying to scan this from the article, what you have on the far left-hand side should be a complete face. So it's a little bit misleading that way. But imagine that it's a complete face that includes everything that you see in the center and the chin. Everything is there. It's the profile of a woman, let's say a sort of classical Greek woman's face. Over time, what happens if you fix that image on the retina is the image begins to pull apart where different pieces are there, and I call particular attention to the last piece. Notice that it's a profile. Okay? Now, this is the results of an experiment by an American psychologist named Bronson. He's done several of these experiments. The child on the left is 2 weeks old. The child on the right is 12 weeks old. The large dots, the two very large blue dots, are where the camera is recording the eye movements of the child from. Then what you have on the left-hand side is that the newborn baby, the eye movements of the newborn baby go straight to the area of highest visual contrast in the visual field. And other experiments showed that if you put a line there, the baby's eye will actually jump over the line. The line disrupts and where you have a discontinuity in the amount of illuminance. But it's still the point of highest contrast. This is very standard replicable finding. At 12 weeks, notice that the child is scanning the entire object. Now this is the fact, the following. Newborn babies, 2-week-olds, when they discriminate the shape of their mother, when they recognize their mother by her profile, by the hairline, if it's sideways, by the nose line, and they are completely indifferent to the eyes unless you get movement of the eyes. So if you have a standard picture, or if you have the mother in various poses, research shows that what the children do here, what happens in the fixed image, is what happens with newborn babies when they look at their mother. And at 2 weeks, it is very, very difficult to attribute that kind of finding, the enormous sensitivity to rapid changes in the illuminance of the light, to any form of learning. Right? It's not, 2 weeks is basically, I assume you could do it if you could control, if the child was, there are moments of sufficient organization, you'd find this at birth. I take this to be an example of a phylogenetic constraint on human vision, that you can find very similar phenomena down to the frog. And it's a part of the history, the phylogenetic history of the human visual system. So what I'm going to argue is that one part of the construction of an image is constrained by phylogenetic constraints. This is one part of the cultural historical story about the hybrid nature of human beings. The next part of the story. Suppose instead of a human face, you present a monogram. Monogram?
Монограмма.
Monogramma. You present HB, по-английски. Now, as HB falls apart, when you fix it, it falls apart in a very regular way. Every part it falls into has independent cultural meaning. So it can fall into an H, it can fall into a B, it can fall into a 3, it could fall into a 4. I assume it could fall into a P, right? So that when the image starts to come apart and before it goes all gray, the parts it falls apart into are themselves now not phylogenetically constrained. They're culturally constrained. Because this has been done with literate people, with college students, for whom their entire existence as college students means that they can mediate their interactions through such symbols so rapidly with so little effort that Donald Hebb referred to these as cell assemblies. In our discussion of this work in the lab, we've used the analogy of firmware, and firmware in Russian is
Аппаратные средства.
but mozga of the brain. So you have these culturally experience-driven sets of constraints. So I argue, every image has 3 parts. One part is phylogenetically constrained. One part is culturally constrained. And one part requires the active resolving process of the individual human brain. And without the discoordination, an entire image of the world is impossible. And I want to hold on to that, this sort of Hegelian 3-part thing, but if you work in mediation, you come up with something like that as a minimal structure. So the main line at the bottom is some degree of discoordination is necessary for normal consciousness. So the reality of all things is partially a consequence of discoordination. to the extent that there is discoordination, the individual has to and can engage in this resolving activity that makes meaning, that gives the illusion of continuity, and that I'm claiming is the process, the microprocess of consciousness. Now, this insight is captured intuitively by the poet Rilke, writing in German. And we've had some difficulty dealing with how to convey this.
Maybe you can explain through the students.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, your student's example. That was very good.
Which student's example?
How unicorn doesn't.
Oh, yeah, I will. I will. Okay. Yeah, and it's, how do you say it in Russian?
Единорог.
Yeah, единорог, right, по-русски. So I can come back to this figure, but here it is in English. And the problem is that there's another poem which exists in Russian, and when Olga was first trying to find a translation, she found a translation of the other one, and we ran out of time. And besides which, it's not fair to ask a graduate student in communication to be a translator of poetry from German to English back to Russian. So.
Просто не могу это сделать.
Okay, so I will read it. I will read it slowly for those of you who understand English better than you read it, and then I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit. This is the creature there never has been. They never knew it, and yet, nonetheless, they loved the way it moved. So its suppleness, its neck, its very gaze, mild and serene. Not there because they loved it. It behaved as though it were. They always left some space. And in that clear, unpeopled space they saved, it lightly reared its head with scarce a trace of not being. They fed it, not with corn, but only with the possibility of being. And that was able to confer such strength that its brow put forth a horn, one horn. Whitely it stole up to the maid to be within the silver mirror and in her. Okay? Now, the first part of this insight is, the first thing to notice is that it never has existed. Никогда не существовал. Это продукт воображения. И по-выгодски это результат соединения настоящих элементов ежедневного мира. Так? Значит, совсем совпадает вот с описанием творчества Vygotsky's. Now, let me just go, yeah. When...
Show the picture.
Well, so then, I just wanted to make sure the picture was there. I now engage my students, and I'm going to ask one of you. Let's see, I'm going to ask the woman in the red sweater sitting to the right-hand side of Gita Lvovna. Right-hand side of Gita Lvovna. Have you ever seen a unicorn? No. Okay. Now I'm going to go to Anna, Shane. Anna, have you ever seen a unicorn?
I have seen a unicorn.
Okay. You've seen it? Oh, so, when I lecture, right, this is the creature. Everybody, all my students, imagine 300 students. I read this poem, and I ask them, have you ever seen a unicorn? And immediately, they don't know what to answer. All right? They just, because I often think that's the way Alexander Luria's peasants in Central Asia reacted when he gave them a syllogism. Like, what is this person asking this question for? Okay. So, nobody answers. So my next question is, for all of you, if you think of a unicorn, and Olga reminds me this is a Western European tradition. I don't know to the extent to which it exists as a Russian tradition. But in the Western European tradition, is a unicorn good or bad? Good. Good. all my students right away tell me. I say, how do you know it's good if it doesn't exist? And then starts a discussion of, it turns out certainly every girl in the classroom at some time in her life has had either a picture of a unicorn, has had a doll unicorn. I have my own favorite kind of unicorn. My favorite kind of unicorn is made of multicolored glass. And it has a little attachment, and I put it on the window of my office where the afternoon sun comes down through the multicolored unicorn. And it's beautiful, and it makes me feel good. Right? So at that point, we have to understand that in a very deep way. That which is imagined can be reified and made real, and being made real reacts back on us as an instrument of both of our imagination and for our own benefit, and in some cases we imagine things that are non-beneficial, and that idea is very nicely illustrated in this fragment of a poem. You have to study it a long time. That goes back to not there because they loved it. It behaved as though it were. They always left some space, and they fed it. The leaving the space, of course, is necessary because otherwise everything would be totally fixated. Without space, without some discoordination of movement, no image. Now, there's a completely different way to interpret all of this, of course. This way. So this image, right, you can find a series of these images in the Cluny Monastery in central Paris, right? It could be that all that Rilke is doing is giving you a written representation of a picture. But I think that if you go back and forth from looking at what he said, you know that he's not giving a literal representation. He's truly representing it, but he's truly representing it in a deviant, novel way that's enormously creative. Okay, so I move away from the idea of representation as anything like a copy theory. All representation has imagination as a necessary part of it. Okay. Now here's another property I want to talk about images. They have time extent. All right? Now here, I just took these off the web. I usually use advertisements. And to save time, I'm going to simply tell you the kinds of results I get. If I ask a student, describe that to me, they describe an event. They'll say something, there's a professor giving a chemistry lesson to some students. And where were the students earlier? Oh, they were in another class. What was the professor doing earlier? He was preparing all of this stuff to be able to do this. What are they going to do later? They'll tell you a story about they're going to go out and have tea. Right? And all there is that picture. They never, never, never say, well, I see patches of red and blue. The blue has a yellow stripe down the middle of it. None of that. They immediately interpret it, and in order to interpret it, they create a story of which it's simply one moment. All images have time extent. Anything with time extent has variability. There's another example. So you could describe that in purely physicalistic terms, but nobody would ever think of doing it. Right? Here two guys are walking along, one maybe more experienced than the other, having a conversation about business, perhaps, or something academic. A guy's carrying a briefcase. But you make up a story in order to see the thing. You don't see it unless you make up a story. Okay. Here's some other properties of images. Here, I think I may force Olga to do a little bit of reading for the Russian audience to remind them. I'm going to run through this just very briefly for Americans, many of whom have not read The Idiot.
Dostoevsky.
By Dostoevsky. And this particular scene is always, for many different reasons, has deeply affected me in the way I think about human consciousness and representation. This particular example comes early in the novel when Prince Mishkin has returned from Europe and he goes to tea at the Yapanchin household. And there are 3 marriageable daughters in this household, and they all believe they're very clever, and they tease him. And at one point he tells about seeing a man executed. And they say, "Prince, you must draw a picture of that man."
No. No. It's okay, I'll explain.
All right. What am I saying? Please, now. I don't have the text in front of me. So.
Я по-русски буду говорить, да?
Okay.
Князь Мышкин говорит, он обращается к Аделаиде, одной из сестер, говорит: "Давичи, действительно, у меня мысль была, когда вы у меня сюжет для картины спрашивали, дать вам сюжет, нарисовать лицо приговоренного за минуту до удара гильотины."
Okay, so the Prince Mishkin has been challenged by them to draw a picture of something, and he chooses as a task drawing the picture of a man who is about to have his head cut off on a guillotine. And then from there, I'm going to switch into English because I think the Russians mostly know this. He starts to describe the picture. When he describes the picture, he starts from the moment when the man in prison wakes up. And he describes the man's thinking, that he's tremendously sensitive to his surroundings, that people bring him a last meal, that somebody tries to comfort him in a certain way. He's taken in a cart through town, and he describes the people around him, and there's one thing he can't think about. He cannot think about his own non-existence, the end of his life. So he's constantly sensitive, enormously sensitive to everything around him. And Mishkin describes this as a narrative. He finally, with help trembling, climbs the stairs, puts his head down on the headrest for the guillotine. He hears the guillotine falling. And then there's this ghoulish question. Maybe his head for a second or two realizes that his head has been cut off. And then he stops and he says, "That's it. That's the picture. The face of the man, the people in the background watching. That's it." Как по-русски?
Я просто последний кусочек прочитаю. Нарисуйте эшафот так, чтобы видна была ясно и близко одна только последняя ступень. Преступник ступил на нее, голова, лицо бледное, как бумага. Священник протягивает крест, тот жадностью протягивает свои синие губы и глядит, и все знают. И все знает. Крест и голова, вот картина. Лицо священника, палача, его 2 служителей и несколько голов и глаз снизу. Все это надо нарисовать как бы на 3-м плане, в тумане, для аксессуара. Вот такая картина.
So here's a completely different example from this kind of example, right? But it shows exactly the same principle. That all image, and you get, when you read this, you cannot help but be moved by it, and you cannot help but creating an image of the scene. And he captures it for you. So then finally, I want to do a demonstration, and I guess, Natalia, I'll ask you to do this because it's easy. You're right near a microphone. I'd like you to imagine a chair for me. You can close your eyes, just anything. Just imagine your idea of a prototypical chair. Камера, можно двигаться направо? Просто Natalia не видит.
Sorry, Dan, imagine.
Okay. Okay, now, I want to ask you some questions about the chair.
Okay.
Is it the kind of chair that has arms? Or does it have, is it just a plain chair?
It has arms.
It has arms. Are you looking at it so you can see its arms and its back? Or
No, actually, from the front.
from the front? Okay, but that's so you can see the. Can you see the seat?
Yes, yes.
What's the
I
seat made of?
see
Is it made of wood or is it plush?
It's a wooden chair.
Okay, it's a wooden chair. Where is it located? Is it near a window? Is it somewhere else?
Oh, it's in the middle of my room.
It's in the middle of the room. Where are you standing?
I'm at the door,
Okay.
entering the room.
Thank you very much. So,
Welcome.
notice the properties of what just happened. Sometimes people tell me it's in space. It doesn't matter. I can ask, where are you standing? Notice that your image is actually a relationship, an imagination that you're a part of. It's an interaction. Without you in the image of the chair, there can be no image of the chair. Correct?
Yes, it's correct, and it's very interesting interpretation.
Right? Okay, so...
I agree, yeah.
Right. And I think that's related to a very deep problem we have as human beings, and that the man in Dostoevsky had. We cannot imagine our own non-existence without our being there. Try sometime as you're going home this evening, try to think of a condition under which you could imagine your own non-existence in which you were not in some scene. You no longer exist, your family's unhappy, you might be sitting there watching yourself be buried, but you are there doing it. It is a relationship. It is a part of this process of vyobrażenia. And it's an interaction. It has time extent. It's structured. Okay? These are all important elements where опосредствование, mediation, творчество, creating things, сознание, come together around this process. And I think Suvorov is completely correct in this interpretation of the idea of vyobrażenia. Okay. So we could have the opposite. I'm almost done now. We could have the opposite situation. What if we had total discoordination? Is that possible? And the answer is yes. I had one picture I could find of such an apparatus, and I didn't use it, but we have, maybe Olga can help explain, it's used for therapy sometimes, where people are put into a tank with tepid water, and it's closed over, and white noise is piped in, and they just sort of float there in the tank.
It's like барокамера в воде.
Right. And white noise comes in.
I don't know, why not?
White noise, it's random noise.
Случайный шум просто.
And it's used in the short term as therapy. People who can fall into a very deep sleep because there's no connection. They think over things they wanted to think over, but within about 48 hours, if they're not allowed out of there, you can give them a problem like, what is 2 times 8? And they cannot answer the question. Their cognitive processes become completely disorganized because any movement of theirs is completely discoordinated, independent of anything happening in their environment. So, okay, I'm going to get back to that. So, and so I have in this number 3 here this conclusion that some degree of coordination is necessary for normal consciousness. And Vygotsky, toward the end of his life, and me, perhaps toward the end of my life, come to appreciate Spinoza. And one of Spinoza's very interesting ideas is that we live between the infinitely large and the infinitely small, between the totally structured and the totally random. And human consciousness exists because there's partial structure there, but there's the necessity of vyobrażenia. That is not completely, totally locked down. So those are my major ideas that I wanted to talk about. And then what I thought I would do is, we had a conversation. I sort of talked about these ideas with our research group yesterday morning, and we started to talk about the ideas for education. And those of you who know my work of the last many years know that I deliberately mix play, and education in after-school context where children have more freedom than they have in school. I really believe in giving children a lot of freedom to find things that are interesting to them and to create rich environments for that. But we want to now take these principles and apply them to education. And I'll answer any questions about what I've been saying so far, but I thought for our discussion, why not start with some basic ideas? And here's just some very general comments about education. And I would be interested in hearing from you. It's your turn to see, can we make something out of this juxtaposition? Principle number one, all human thought is a mixture of elements with different degrees of duration, with different degrees of biological necessity for us. That thinking always requires some degree of imagination. And the world each of us exists in at any given moment is partly a fantasy of our own, is partly an image that we made up and is a creative synthesis, which the Russians refer to as smysl or sense, which is then reified, embodied in meaning and words that are shared between people, but no two people have the same understanding of any word in any language, not even identical twins. Okay. But the thinking then requires some constraints. You can't, without the constraints, we come apart. We can't think. So, the gigantic challenge in a completely abstract way, which can be embodied in many concrete versions, is how do we create the proper mix? The proper mix of those things, those physical constraints. You're in a class, if Scott pulls back the camera, you'd see we're sitting in a classroom, the physical constraints of which constrain the kind of communication that can go on here. Not just any kind of communication can go on. Our knowledge of language provides, and language provides a different set of constraints and resources. Those are partly phylogenetic and are partly cultural. The same is true of any classroom. So in trying to think about the relationship between creativity and education, we must be able to think about the architecture of the environments that we create, the forms of activity that we create, the openness to the rest of the world that we create, trying always to give children as much freedom as possible, but not to have any illusions that there are phylogenetic constraints on what it is that they can acquire and that you can arrange for acquiring, that there are cultural constraints which if you violate them are going to be very harmful to the children, but that the children are going to have to recreate and вообразить их будущего, their future, not our future. We won't be here. So we all know, дети они наше будущее, children are our future. I think that proverb, поговорка, существует на всех языках, but it has, like all proverbs, there's a deep truth to it, and there's an allusion to it. So we try to tell the children what our future is going to be, instead of arranging for them to create their future. So it seems to me the deep obligation of the successful pedagogue is to create the condition for our children to create their future. And may there be little bloodshed in the way they work it out. Thank you. За внимание. Thank you very much for your attention. Anna, you have a question.
Yes, I have a question, but I would like to ask you first to talk more about that triangle where you have an object,
Yes,
which is a little bit above the other object, and I somehow where the mediation by the artifacts is that mediation that creates that this continuity between the reality,
Right.
and then what creates the continuity?
Ah, that's the resolving activity of the human brain. And you know, part of what is left out of this account of creativity when we move to the classroom, and you can't talk about everything in every talk, right? But in lab we discussed, very important, when is a novel behavior, a novel product, creative, and when isn't it? And that's not an individual decision. That's not the decision of the person who deviates. That's a social process that whether it becomes considered creative and a part of the cultural repertoire or not is a collective cultural process, which definitely goes on in classrooms, but I think is missing when you have these kind of individual level representations that you're being psychological and too individualistic. So there's a whole other layer of discussion and about the time parameters of social interaction in institutionalized context, which I would relate back to, you know, the fragment from Mandelstam, right? If you forget the word you started to say, then thought unembodied returns to the hall of shadows. If you say it, somebody else may pick it up and carry it further and change it. It has a chance to live. So
could I just make a comment on Jeff Malik Jones here from Simon Fraser University in Canada? It seems to me that this problem that you put forward here is one that is, in some sense, not solved, but it exists within the issue of language itself. In other words, that that language is both event and structure.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely.
That language gives us this possibility constantly. It both, in some sense, constitutes what we say. In other words, it is both langue and parole. So it both structures what we say through its forms, both at the sentence level, both at the semiotic, at the semantic, and then at the hermeneutic level. So you have these structures which are, some of them, the higher ones very cultural, and other ones inherent in the necessity of having a language, and then through the various forms of the way in which even the grammar functions, for example, the subjunctive case, or the modals within sentences, the might and the may, and then primarily, in recursive terms, through the semantic innovation of the metaphor, and that is the opening up of the possibility of creating new meanings when the subject and the predicate, when the predicate surprises the subject. So what I would say is that many of these issues for educators are much more, shall we say, interesting and perhaps more useful if we see them as part of the great issue that language, the great benefit that language has for us. In other words, it both constitutes us and opens us up to the futurity which you've talked about.
Oh, I entirely agree. It's part of, but I guess if I were to go that direction in trying to think about this, I would really want to look very carefully, not in my own writing, right? I say what I'm talking about applies equally to words and language as to any other kind of artifact. And there are special properties, I think, to language in our ability to, in its flexibility and speed, and it has a lot of properties for us that are extremely important. But I would apply the same principles, and I agree with you. On the other hand, as you well know, as an educator worried about language, things like whether or not you're in rows looking forward, or all of the other kinds of structuration that are there are essential to the meaning making of the language process itself. You can't just say anything in any conditions.
No, but those desks in which you're sitting can be moved. They can be moved. You can move them around, and that's one of the things you can. And particularly when you're dealing at a certain level with language, at the artistic level, at the level of performance,
right,
where process and product are one, which is one of the things. It's one of the interesting reasons to do that kind of work with kids, where particularly if you're performing a poem, in its performance, the product and the process become melded, so you don't get the kind of separation that enables certain kinds of people to reify and objectify. So I would be less interested in the physical properties of the room. I was brought up in a Welsh grammar school where the desks were nailed to the ground and where we were held in quite rigid thrall, but it was a place filled with language, imagination, music and song because of the fact of the culture we were in. So you can transcend some aspects of your physical culture through will, through spirit, and particularly through the use of the imagination.
Well, I don't disagree. I've seen wonderful teaching happening in rooms like this, but it doesn't afford certain features that I would like to create. So I think your point about being able to make the changes, sometimes yes. I sometimes here at the University of California teach in a classroom which is I don't know which are rows and columns, but essentially I have 5 rows deep and 50 rows wide, and my podium is here. I can't get a group discussion going, small group discussion going in that room. Luckily, I live in Southern California. I can send people outside to talk to each other. So I'm just I think these things all play, you can get good education in a room like this, right? And I think even using this complex medium with our complex language discontinuities, I hope that there's been some education and thought and maybe even a little bit of torch creation going on with all of these constraints. So I agree with you. I'm not saying you have to tear the whole thing up and throw it away in order to get decent education. That's definitely not the case.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, thank you.
Could I offer something in relation to this? My name's Tag McIntaggart. In relation to spatial, is exactly what this discussion about the physical conditions in relation to the kind of education that can happen. Because if, as I've been trying to keep in mind in my teaching, we are shifting, I am wanting to shift the paradigm of the relationship between the teacher and the learner from I, the teacher, am demanding this of you, the student, to a position which says it, the task, the endeavour, the activity, demands this of us. Then the physical layout of the space in which we are co-teaching and learning either reflects that paradigm or it doesn't. And if we are in rows, and I, the teacher, am at the front, and you, the students, are behind these rows, then in fact you have the physical space contradicting the of the educator to change the paradigm.
Right.
So, whilst I don't disagree with Jeff that you can of course have educational activity which is happening, which is inspiring, which can fill people with passion and so on. Nonetheless, if you are, particularly as I was for 4.5 years working in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you're working in a system where the legacy of the history of that system is a didactic, utilitarian, memorizing-based system, you can't shift that paradigm by simply trying to talk it into existence. It has to be brought physically into existence in the space, in the educational space. And one of the remarkable things about the way in which the teachers took that on board, despite the fact that they were still in a situation where the headmaster, where the pattern of desks and teacher's desk in the classroom is laid down at state level. You can't change the way that the classroom is laid out without permission from the head teacher.
Right.
Nonetheless, a number of the teachers that I worked with, and one in particular, managed to get her students to the point where in 2 minutes they could change the classroom from what she called classroom into workshop and back again from workshop into classroom. Every child knew which desk and chair they were moving, and they simply moved the desks and chairs to line the walls of the classroom so they could use a circle for the activity, whatever that activity was. But if the whistle came down the corridor, the principal's coming, the classroom could be put back to classroom immediately.
Right.
In 2 minutes, it could be recreated.
Right. But unless I'm mistaken, we don't disagree here. I think I run into the same phenomenon. Jeff, so we're talking here about the idea.
I mean, I don't think we want to necessarily go on about this stuff. I think what's much more interesting is the way in which these questions of mediation and imagination. That's the stuff I would like to talk about.
Oh, that's fine. I was just going to introduce the idea of affordances. Some environments make it easier to do than other environments, and
sure.
And there is a social constraint that we face in the United States where working class parents disapprove of the form of education that was just being described. They want the didactic form of education.
In some cases, for good reason, because progressivism, or certain kinds of progressivism, actually makes it very difficult for working class kids to get at the content knowledge that will give them access to power, whereas middle class kids get it at home. So some of those intuitions are based upon upon some realities.
No, absolutely right. And had we time, I was going to give an example of where there are times when we want to be fairly rigid in the classroom in ways that otherwise you wouldn't want to be. So I think it's the organization of the multiple means in a proper way that is the issue. And there's many ways to skin that cat.
I agree with you.
How about some questions from a Russian?
У нас есть вопрос. Гита Львовна, не вопрос, просто сказать хочет.
Пожалуйста.
Профессор Кол, мы очень благодарны вам за то, что вы приняли участие в наших 4-х чтениях, посвященных Выгодскому. И были бы очень рады видеть вас в нашем институте на им Выгодский.
Thank you. Спасибо. Я чувствую себя просто очень счастливым, что я мог таким образом принимать участие, потому что у меня не было никаких других возможностей. И то, что мы можем, устроить сознание, co-knowledge, через такого прибора, это отлично. И это говорит о будущем, какие мы можем устроить международные курсы. Это не должен быть, что новый институт Выгодского существует только в Москве. Это может быть и одновременно международный институт. И важно, по-моему, так делать.
Вы знаете, у нас еще есть вопросы, Михаил Лестерович, в аудитории. Пожалуйста. Можно?
Пожалуйста, конечно.
Пожалуйста.
Меня зовут Татьяна Швиленкова. Я хотела бы спросить следующее. Если репрезентацию понимать не только как тот процесс, который протекает на сетчатке глаза, но исходить из того, что без какой-либо репрезентации мы вообще, с помощью рисунка или вербального описания, мы, по сути дела, ничего не знаем о том образе воображения, которое формируется у человека, то, наверное, что-то происходит между формированием образа и процессом его репрезентации. Не на сейчас, скажем, вербальной репрезентации или же в рисунке. Так вот, что происходит?
Да, но здесь это...
Между образом, который создается, и процессом репрезентации, скажем, в словесном описании или в рисунке.
Но это надо, я думаю, в каждый случай надо изучать, потому что это зависит именно, если это рисунка, если это поэма. И думать, что процесс единичный в каждый случай, я так и не верю. Может быть, и существуют какие-то абстрактные процессы сходные, но здесь мы должны употреблять идеи подниматься до конкретного. Я не знаю по-русски. To rise to the concrete. Ну как, Наталья, rise to the concrete.
Восхождение к конкретному. Восхождение к конкретному.
Да, и вот это, я думаю, что этот вопрос поднимается, где Рылка, я думаю, употребляя вот эту рисунку на ковер, Он, с одной стороны, он описывает, с другой стороны, он представляет, он воображает. Да, не слышно.
Нет, он сначала воображает, и этот образ существует у него в голове. А потом этот образ выносится на ковер, он изображается на ковре, представляется, существует и его репрезентация на ковре.
Ага.
А вот что между тем образом, который в голове, и той репрезентацией, которая на ковре или в рисунке, или в слове, или в вербальной речи?
Но я думаю, что этот предмет сейчас когнитивной психологии всего мира, что происходит. И сам слово representation имеет так много разных значений, что очень трудно вообще отвечать на этот вопрос. Это очень хороший вопрос. Но это именно, почему мы должны не стараться решить все эти проблемы в одной сессии. Это невозможно. За это надо спецкурс, сделаем на месяц, значит, иметь, и не только вот лицо к лицу, как мы сейчас более-менее взаимодействовать, но употребляют тоже обсуждение в сеть. Вот, как listserv, но Наталья знает, как мы это грубо сделали в прошлом году, но хотя вот технически грубый, идея была совсем хорошей. Потому что можно было дать разные примеры и близиться к одной теме. Потому что сначала, употребляя слово representation, Бог его знает, что это обозначает. И думать, что процессы одни и то же, вне зависимости от чего, от сам предмет. Я просто боюсь, что это идут в тупик. Если это так сложно. Когда я был первый год в учебе в колледж, я должен был, я хотел что-то не по плану. И я поступил в курс искусства. Я должен был рисовать. Я страшно рисую. Страшно. И вот мой учитель был страшно. Я очень хотел. Но у меня талант негативный просто. Очень плохой. И я получил двойка. Но это один раз в жизни, в колледж, я такой плохой наград получил. Потом, через 5 месяцев, я уже ушел из класса и принял более-менее, что вот я никогда не буду артист. И художник. И я видел выставку студенческих произведений. И вот я видел мой рисунок. Другой профессор видел то, что я делал, не понимая, что у меня никакого таланта не было, и думала, что именно вот этот образ был очень интересный. Да, поэтому это тоже мы должны включить, этот процесс. Я боюсь в России сейчас употреблять слово диалектика, но все-таки это диалектический процесс. Но Ольга она запоминает меня, что вот есть несколько слов, которые уже сложно употреблять. Но все-таки этот процесс очень сложный. И здесь надо, я думаю, по-другому поступать, чтобы успеть делать прогресс. Но это я готов принимать участие в такой дискуссии. Это очень хороший вопрос.
Спасибо.
Ну, спасибо вам.
Есть еще вопросы? Нет.
Но если так мало вопросов, или все абсолютно все понимали, и я знаю, что я меньше половины сам понимал, или они ничего не понимали, должен быть еще. Спор, давайте. Замечание.
Еще есть вопрос.
Да, пожалуйста.
Бонни.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Bonnie Cram from the University of Georgia in the U.S., not the Georgia here.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly interested in creativity research, and I'm curious as to how you're defining creativity, because I didn't really see the connection. I heard you talking about imagination, which I think is part of it, but I would I didn't really see what was the creativity part, and I'm jet lagged, so maybe I missed it.
Yeah, being jet lagged is, it's really tough being, and you're very brave being up at this time of day. Vygotsky himself, when I was speaking, I was depending upon the knowledge of an audience that had read. I'm not a specialist in creativity, right? And I was depending upon an audience that had read the certain basic writings by Vygotsky on creativity, and saying that creativity results from the combinatory possibilities of the human brain. It's always based on reality that puts together things in different ways from reality, and that involves something like imagination, that combination. But that it's very, when I think about creativity, I've always asked the question, how do you know it isn't just a deviation? And that was the question that I was focusing on. That you need a social process when you produce something that says this is creative versus this is just garbage, and we know we have in modern art, for example, we have absolutely no agreement on what constitutes creativity or not. So I was really addressing it as a process of deviation, and emphasizing that even when we think somebody's not being creative, even if you try to replicate exactly what somebody else does, there's an element of creativity in it. Human language is not learnable without creativity. Jeff, if you've never read, there's a book I always use on this called From 2 to 5 by Kornei Chukovsky, which is just, he has the most wonderful discussion my students can understand about why the acquisition of language is a creative process. So I'm coming at it from a different angle from Csikszentmihalyi or whoever's doing that, and I don't know that literature well, and I had roughly 6 hours in which to prepare this talk. So I just
oh, that's all right.
So I think it's there again. I think it'd be very interesting.
Could I just ask you another question, and that is to do with you. I know I've been reading Vygotsky stuff on play, and as well, one of the things that I find interesting is the way in which, again, something that the way in which play forms you. In other words, we seem to be a species, if you like, that bootstraps itself into complexity. Initially through play and then through other ways. And I agree with you that developing that capacity, whichever it is one of this is the zone, proximal development sort of thing, especially in play and imagination. This is one of the most important elements that we must not destroy in children, and we must in fact enhance that.
And what we're doing is we're trying to turn children into homework repetition robots, at least in my state, in my country. I went to work after school with children because in school I couldn't defeat the iron cage that the children were being put in. And when I started 15 years ago, after school, nobody paid attention except for sports. Now, I have an article on my webpage called School Invades After School. We are colonizing children's lives in a way which I think may be historically unprecedented.
But the parents are complicit in this, because kids after school are driven around the city to karate lessons, to piano lessons. They're being formed in ways, and there is no time for play.
That's correct. So, I don't know about you, but I think play lasts throughout. It may be a leading activity of early childhood, as Elkonin would say, right? But I don't think play ever stops. if you don't think I'm playing now, you're dead wrong. You know, I'm having a perfectly good time and playing in my own way, and so are you. And if we didn't do that, life wouldn't be worth living. You know.
Well, as long as you're not playing around too much.
Well, exactly. But remember, to go back to Spinoza, life is lived between these extremes. You know.
More question from Russian speakers in Russian.
Может быть, по-русски еще один-два вопроса. Вот здесь студенты сидят, как они молчают.
Студенты?
No?
Нет.
Все?
Нет.
Окей.
Есть один вопрос.
Ага.
Оля.
Hi, I'm Russian psychologist. Ex-Russian psychologist, now I work.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
And seeing you.
I can't see you either. So.
I'm Russian psychologist
Yes.
who now got possibility to practice in Canada.
Uh-huh.
My question is, how modern technology, especially computer technology, will change the process of imagination in human brain? What do you think about it? Because the whole generation now actually grew up on substitution of process, or partly substitution of process of representation, because computers doing it as a mediator.
Okay. Thank you for that question. In 2 weeks, I'm going to give a talk in Finland on starting with Vygotsky's idea of psychological tools, and then trying to talk about what does it mean, and how do we apply the idea of psychological tools as Vygotsky understood them to the contemporary era, and what has changed, what might be changed in human consciousness as a result of the different kinds of tools we use. I do a lot of work with children and computers. In all the work I do, I always include activities that are isomorphic to the computer activities, but are not on a computer. My students who work with the children play with the children. We call it work from one leg, but they're there to play with the children. It is a common observation that they have much richer discussions and develop much richer social relations than when the child is interacting with a computer. If you have the same kind of thing and have it as a board game or something else. So my view, again, in a long historical view, is that with the addition of every new medium, you open up new possibilities for human experience in the world and new ways of coordinating in time and space. And for every new possibility that you have, you lose some number of possibilities. New media do not replace old media. They displace them. And so the question will still remain, what are the possible useful combinations? So I benefited last spring because Natalia, however she found her way there, found her way to a course that was on a web board, and I got a great education in thought and language, мышление и речь. Right?
Спасибо.
Right? And so I thought that was a big positive. On the other hand, we're talking about doing some experiments. I think we ought to sit down, we ought to try them out. That's very hard to do. So again, it comes to this idea of use a toolkit metaphor of culture. That's a very useful. If you know my work, you know I use different metaphors, and I don't say that one metaphor fits all, right? So you want to use it well. But I do think that we should take advantage of this kind of medium. There are advantages. Anna knows it. She knows that she can be in contact with people she could not be in contact with otherwise, and she can do it for very little money, and she can do it on her time schedule, not theirs. That's different. Here, we're locked in time. We have the great advantage of the broad bandwidth of seeing each other and so on, right? But there's an advantage to a web board, right, which will allow Volodya Spiridonov, who gets up late and goes to bed very late to interact with me and on some other time thing, right? So I think you again want to invent new cultural practices that have new mixtures of these things, depending upon what the challenges are that are facing us and will be facing us.
I'm talking about a particular problem when children using messenger to communicate, school children, and their language is really short. How it's possible for them to develop their metaphoric thinking and metaphoric language?
Well,
they learn to think fast.
No, wait. Again, Olga's response is they learn to think fast. They also learn to type, right? And if you actually study what they're doing, new metaphors arise within messaging, right? So and new forms of cheating in class. You think I don't get people turning everything off in a large class because otherwise they have a friend with a book sitting in front of them outside and they're busy texting, right? So, and if Russians haven't gotten there, they will. And so, again, yes, you could say that children who spend all their time doing texting or messaging are going to learn an impoverished form of written language. Now, if that's the only thing they do, you're right. On the other hand, if it's one of the things they do, they might be learning some things that are actually, you can turn it around, bring some of it into the classroom, and show them and give them a meta-linguistic awareness of the skills that they use. We're right now discussing the work of an African-American woman who brings in African-American literature with a particular speech genre which is not polite in other cultural circumstances. She uses that to give her students, high school students, a meta-linguistic awareness of the genre, to give them confidence that they can do this kind of analysis, and that Shakespeare is just another genre. So if what they know here, they can do over here, right? So I think that really, I would not get caught into this thing about, there's some parts that bother me. Television rots children's brains. Computers are alienating. Any of those general statements are wrong. They're just wrong. Computer has been there for some people, it's alienating. For other people, it creates community that they wouldn't have otherwise. Why would you think it would be one without the other, since whatever it is depends on the social organization of the activity? Now that I learned in Russia. I didn't learn that here. But you can go too far, right? I learned that in Russia too. Okay, so I think that your question is a very good one. If we had more time, we could. There's very interesting work on using an abacus. Shote, right? With Japanese experts that shows that very clearly that they are using a mental abacus to do huge towers of numbers. They have infinite memory span for digits. Why? Because all they're doing is sitting there and imagining the abacus, right? And they're faster than a calculator because they can do that faster than you can enter the numbers, right? On the other hand, they're completely rigid. So if you gave them 999 10 times, I'll tell you the answer is 990 because I just use a little shortcut. They'll add up 999 9 times. They'll do it fast, but I bet you I could be faster in that case. So I was saying before, sometimes there are things we want people to really master in a rigid way. They do have consequences for brain organization, but don't reduce it to brain organization because they're part of a cultural practice, which makes that a valued form of activity, right? And the challenge for the teacher is a design problem, for sure. And having somebody who whistles when they see the principal coming down the hallway. Very important social role. Very important social role. A lot of people get in trouble. If they deviate too much, their teaching is not seen as creative. It's seen as a nuisance. Right? So it's a pretty good example right there. I think we've gone an hour and a half. That's how much time we've allotted to all of this. I want to thank you. Thank you. And to thank the Russian State University for the Humanities for making this kind of interaction possible. I hope you've learned one thing. I'm speaking here to my Russian colleagues. Это мы можем делать в любой день, когда вы хотите это сделать. И не только со мной, но и с другими. Поэтому это не должен быть уникальный случай. Это должен стать новый культурный тип деятельности. Ну и спокойной ночи.
Михаил Лестрович, а Елена Евгеньевна хочет спасибо сказать.
Большое спасибо, и мы обязательно воспользуемся. И это первая попытка, первый ком, но первый блин, он не оказался комом, и мы очень надеемся, что дальше это будет продолжаться, чтобы появлялось новое воображение и творчество. Спасибо.
Спасибо, до свидания.
До свидания.
До скорого свидания.